The man on the ridge adjusted his scope at 0600 hours and smiled. Below him, FOB Granite lay wide-open soldiers walking predictable routes, vehicles parked in the same positions they had occupied for 11 days straight, and not a single sensor on the northern perimeter showing a green light. He pressed his radio. Confirm positions. We move at 1340. Then he lowered his rifle and whispered to the frozen mountain air, something that would have stopped every heart on that base cold. They don't even know we're already inside their blind spot. Before we go any further, if this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button right now and follow this storyboard all the way to the end. And drop a comment telling me what city you are watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it all began. The drive up the mountain took 4 hours longer than it should have. Rachel Carter sat in the back of a contracted transport vehicle, not military issue, just a white pickup truck driven by a civilian contractor named Pete, who chewed tobacco and kept the radio on a country station that faded in and out with the altitude. She had one bag, a medium-sized duffel that sat between her boots on the floorboard. She wore jeans, a gray fleece pullover, and a wool hat pulled down past her ears. She looked by every measure like exactly what she was supposed to be. A wife, coming to surprise her husband. Pete glanced at her in the rearview mirror for the third time in 20 minutes. You said Captain Carter, right, Daniel Carter? That's right, Rachel said without looking up from the window. Good man, solid officer. Pete spit into a plastic cup. He know you're coming. No, Pete chuckled. Surprise visit? Nice, he's gonna flip. Rachel didn't answer. She was watching the ridgeline. Not in the way a person watches scenery. Not the slow, half-conscious gaze of someone killing time on a long drive. She was watching it the way a person watches something that might move. Her eyes tracked the upper tree line, methodically left to right, pausing at natural breaks in the rock formations at places where the snow had been disturbed in ways that wind alone couldn't explain. She noticed where the road curved and created a natural choke point. She noticed that the last checkpoint they passed had only one guard on duty instead of two, and that the guard had his weapon slung over his shoulder rather than held at ready. She said nothing about any of it. She turned away from the window and stared at her hands instead. They were still, completely unnervingly still. The hands of someone who had learned a long time ago that stillness was not the absence of readiness. It was readiness in its most disciplined form. Almost there, Pete announced cheerfully. Another 20 minutes, weather permitting. Rachel looked back up at the ridgeline. How's the sensor coverage been up here lately? Pete blinked. Ma'am, the perimeter sensors on the north ridge, has the base had issues with them? Pete's brow furrowed. How would you know about my husband mentioned it? She said quickly. Easy, practiced, in one of his calls, said the cold was giving them trouble. Pete relaxed and nodded. Oh yeah, the cold up here does a number on the equipment. I heard some of the guys talking about it last week. Radar's been finicky too. He shook his head. But hey, that's above my pay grade. Rachel nodded slowly. Sure, of course. She turned back to the window. Above my pay grade. She had heard those words before, usually right before something went very, very wrong. FOB Granite came into view around a long bend in the road, a collection of prefabricated structures, vehicle bays, a communications tower, and a perimeter wall that looked solid from a distance, but revealed its weaknesses the closer you got. Rachel's eyes moved across it the way a chess player moves across a board, not looking at individual pieces, looking at the gaps between them. The northern wall sat in the shadow of the ridge, permanent shadow this time of year, which meant the cameras up there were dealing with contrast issues every single morning during the transition from night to day, which meant there was a window probably 45 to 60 minutes around dawn where northern visual coverage was functionally degraded. The communications tower had two antennae arrays. One was slightly off angle, not enough that anyone would flag it immediately, but enough that in bad weather the signal degradation would be significant. The vehicle bay doors on the eastern side were open. Not unusual, but the vehicles parked inside were arranged in a way that blocked the secondary exit route. If someone needed to move fast in that direction, they'd lose 30, maybe 40 seconds rearranging equipment first. 30 seconds. Rachel had seen men die in less time than that. Pete pulled up to the main gate and exchanged words with the duty guard, a young specialist who looked barely old enough to shave. The guard checked a clipboard, looked at Rachel's ID, looked at her face, looked at her ID again, and waved them through with the polite but slightly flustered energy of someone who didn't get many civilian visitors and wasn't entirely sure what the protocol was. Rachel noted that too. The guard hadn't checked her bag. Nobody had checked her bag. She picked up the duffel and stepped out of the truck into the cold mountain air. It hit her like a wall, dry, sharp, thin at this altitude. She breathed it in and felt something shift in her chest. Not discomfort, something closer to recognition. She had breathed air like this before, in places she didn't talk about anymore. "Mrs. Carter?" The voice came from across the vehicle yard. She turned and saw a young female sergeant jogging toward her with a clipboard and a professional smile. "I'm Sergeant Voss. I was just notified of your arrival. Welcome to FOB Granite. Your husband has been informed he's finishing a briefing and will meet you at the officers' quarters in about 15 minutes. Can I take your bag?" "I've got it," Rachel said. Sergeant Voss nodded and fell into step beside her. "First time visiting the base." "First time here, yes." "It's a little rough around the edges," Voss said with the practiced apology of someone who'd given this speech before. "The altitude takes some getting used to, and the heat in the quarters is inconsistent. The backup systems have been cycling on and off, but it's manageable." Rachel filed that away. Backup heating systems, cycling on and off. That wasn't just a comfort issue. Cycling backup systems meant power draws were unstable. Unstable power draws could affect electronics, could affect communications equipment, could affect sensor arrays. "How long has that been going on?" Rachel asked. Voss glanced at her, slightly surprised by the specificity of the question. "About 2 weeks, I think. Maybe a little longer. Maintenance has looked at it a couple times. And the resolution, they keep saying it's stabilized and then it cycles again." Voss shrugged with the resigned tolerance of someone who had stopped expecting a permanent fix. "We've learned to work around it." They walked past the communications building and Rachel slowed almost imperceptibly. Through the single window, she could see a bank of monitors, 2 operators on duty, and a tangle of cables that ran along the baseboard in a way that suggested hasty installation or a recent repair that hadn't been done cleanly. One of the monitors showed a flickering radar display. The operator watching it tapped the screen twice with 2 fingers, as if that might help. She kept walking. The officers' quarters were in a low structure near the center of the installation. Warm inside, at least for now. Sergeant Voss showed her to a small room that Daniel clearly lived in, his gear organized with a particular brand of military neatness that looked orderly on the surface but revealed to someone who knew him the subtle signs of a man operating under sustained pressure. His coffee mug was on the wrong side of the desk. He always put it on the left. When he was stressed, it ended up on the right. Rachel set her duffel down and sat on the edge of the bed. She closed her eyes. She was here because 3 days ago, Daniel had called her. The call had been routine logistics, a question about a bill, the usual quiet exchange of a military marriage that had learned to exist in the spaces between deployments. But there had been something in his voice. Not fear exactly, not worry. Something more like the particular flatness of a man who was carrying something he didn't know how to name yet. She had asked him if everything was okay. He had said yes. She had known he was lying, not because he was dishonest, because she knew the voice of someone who doesn't see the danger they're in. She had used that voice herself once, a long time ago, 2 days before a mission that went sideways in ways that still woke her up at 3 a.m. So she had packed a bag, called in a few favors to arrange transport, and told herself she was just coming to see her husband. That was the story. She was going to stick to it. The door opened and Daniel walked in, and for a moment everything else in her head went quiet. He was taller than she always expected when she hadn't seen him for a while. That happened every time she carried a mental image of him that was somehow smaller than the reality, and then she'd see him and remember that she had married a man who took up actual space in a room. He had dark circles under his eyes and a week's worth of beard that regulation normally wouldn't have allowed, which told her the command climate up here was either relaxed or distracted. He was wearing his uniform, but he had his jacket halfway off one arm, like he'd been in the process of changing when he got the message. "Rachel." He said her name the way he always said it, like it was both a question and an answer. She stood up. "Hi." He crossed the room in 3 steps and hugged her. She felt the tension in his shoulders the way he held on a beat longer than usual. He was scared, not of anything specific, she thought, of the unnamed thing. He pulled back and looked at her. "You didn't tell me you were coming." "I wanted to surprise you." You succeeded. He searched her face. Is everything okay at home? Everything's fine. Then why bother him? Because I wanted to see you, she said. Is that not enough? Something moved across his expression. Not quite suspicion, more like the look of a man who knows his wife too well to take things entirely at face value, but loves her too much to push. Of course it is. He pulled her in again briefly. Of course it is. You look tired. 4 hours in a truck with a country music fan. He laughed. The laugh was real. That I was good. Pete, yeah, he inflicts that drive on everyone. He let her go and ran a hand through his hair. Okay, let me show you around. I can probably get the afternoon off. We're between operations right now, and honestly, things have been quiet enough that... Daniel, he stopped. She kept her voice completely even. When did the north perimeter sensors start failing? The room got very still. Daniel looked at her for a long moment. How do you know about that? Pete mentioned it. Pete is a contractor driver. People talk to drivers. She held his gaze. When did it start? He exhaled slowly and sat down in the desk chair. The way he moved made her think he'd been waiting for someone to ask that question and hadn't known it until this moment. About 3 weeks ago, started with intermittent drops. The sensors would go offline for a few minutes and come back. We logged it, reported it, put in a maintenance request. And the tech team came up, looked at, it is said it was cold weather degradation. Standard issue. They replaced 2 of the sensor units and said the rest were within acceptable parameters. But they're still dropping. He looked at her. Yeah, they're still dropping. How many are offline right now? Rachel. How many? A long pause. 4 on the north face. She kept her expression neutral. 4 sensors on the north face. The same north face that sat below the ridge. The ridge with the perfect overwatch position. What about communications, the backup channels? Daniel stood up slowly. Why are you asking me these questions? Because I'm your wife and I'm worried about this base. She said it calmly, reasonably, like a person who was above all things just a worried spouse. He studied her for a long moment. She had always been able to hold his gaze longer than was comfortable. Even when they were first dating. Even when he'd asked her things about her past that she gave careful, partial answers to. He had always eventually looked away first. He looked away now. The backup comms have been degraded. We're working on it. What's your contingency if the main communications array goes down? We have protocols. What are the protocols? Rachel. His voice had an edge to it now. Not angry, strained. You're a civilian. You're here as my wife visiting. I'm not going to brief you on base. I know, she said. You're right, I'm sorry. She sat back down on the bed and reached for her duffel, unzipped it and pulled out a paperback book she'd thrown in at the last minute mostly for cover. She opened it to a random page. Daniel watched her for another moment. I'll get us coffee, he said finally. Then I'll show you the base, the parts I'm allowed to show you. That sounds good. He left. She listened to his footsteps down the hallway until she couldn't hear them anymore. Then she put the book down and stared at the wall. 4 sensors down on the north face, degraded backup communications, power cycling through the backup systems, a guard on the main gate who didn't check civilian bags, a radar display that flickered and needed to be tapped back into function by an operator who had clearly learned to accept flickering as normal, and the ridge. She kept coming back to the ridge. She had driven past it on the way in, and her eyes had gone to it automatically the way they went to every high point in every landscape she ever moved through, because high ground was where danger lived. At this particular base, with this particular configuration of structures and pathways, anyone holding the North Ridge had a direct line of sight to approximately 70% of the installation. She thought about the man on the ridge, the one with the scope, the one she didn't know about yet, not specifically, not concretely, but she thought about him anyway in the way that experience sometimes gives you information before you can name its source. She had been trained to think this way, 8 years of training so deep it had become reflex. She had spent a long time trying to train herself back out of it to look at a landscape the way a normal person looked at a landscape, as scenery, as beauty, as background. She had gotten pretty good at it, but she was looking at FOB granite and everything she was seeing was wrong. Not obviously catastrophically wrong, subtly wrong, the kind of wrong that adds up slowly until it becomes a disaster all at once. Daniel came back with 2 mugs of coffee. He handed her one and sat across from her and asked about her sister and her mother and the neighbors who'd adopted a dog that apparently barked at all hours. She answered every question. She laughed in the right places. She held the coffee with both hands and let the warmth seep into her fingers, and she was to every observable measure exactly what she appeared to be. A tired woman who had driven a long way to see her husband. And somewhere behind her eyes in the part of her that never came fully offline, no matter how many years passed or how far she drove from the life she used to live, she was counting. Sensor gaps, communication windows, response time from the duty station to the north perimeter, the number of steps between the officers' quarters and the armory, the angle of the sun on the southern ridge in the afternoon. She was counting, because she had learned a very long time ago that the bases that felt quiet were the ones you had to watch most carefully. That night, Daniel fell asleep early, the particular crashed-out sleep of a man who had been running on insufficient rest for too long and finally allowed himself to stop. Rachel sat in the chair by the small window for a long time. She didn't turn on a light. She just sat in the dark, watching the perimeter lights through the frosted glass. At 200, the lights on the north face flickered, not a power surge, something lower frequency, steadier. She watched the flicker for exactly 47 seconds. Then it stopped. She sat with that for a long time. At 0330, she finally lay down. She didn't take her boots off. Not all the way. She loosened the laces and pulled the blanket up and stared at the ceiling in the particular way that isn't sleep but isn't fully awake either. The in-between state. The ready state. She used to live in the ready state. She thought she had left it behind. But lying in this room on this base on this mountain, with the wind moving through the gaps in the construction and the sensor grid running at 60% capacity on the most vulnerable face of the installation, lying here, she understood something she had been trying not to understand since she got in Pete's truck 8 hours ago. She hadn't come here because she missed her husband. She had come here because something was wrong. And now she was inside the wire. And she could feel it, not in the dramatic way of movies, not like a cold hand on the back of the neck, but in the quiet, certain way of a person whose body had learned to read threat before the mind caught up. A low-grade electrical hum in the base of her chest, the faint tightening of the muscles behind her shoulder blades. She had felt this before, twice. Both times she had been right. She stared at the ceiling and listened to Daniel breathe and told herself that tomorrow she would take another look at the ridge. Just a look, just a walk. She'd say she needed air. She'd say she wanted to see the view. She would be casual and civilian and completely, utterly unalarming. And she would look at the ridge. Because whoever was watching this base from up there had been watching it long enough to know exactly when the sensors went down and exactly how long they stayed down. And they were not watching it by accident. She closed her eyes. She did not sleep. Rachel was up before first light. She didn't make noise. She didn't need to. 8 years of early mornings in conditions that made this mountain base look like a resort hotel had trained her body to transition from horizontal to vertical without ceremony, without sound, without the groaning and shuffling that most people needed to shake off sleep. She was simply lying down, and then she was standing, fully present, boots already tightening at the laces while Daniel's breathing stayed slow and even behind her. She stood at the window for 2 minutes, watched the perimeter lights, counted the intervals between the patrol rotations she could see from this angle. One soldier, walking the inner fence line with his hands in his jacket pockets. She watched him complete half a circuit and disappear around the eastern building. She checked her watch when he vanished and checked it again when he reappeared. 4 minutes and 20 seconds. 4 minutes and 20 seconds of unobserved fence line on the east side during each patrol rotation. She pulled on her fleece and walked to the small common area down the hall to make coffee. The base was not fully awake yet, but it was stirring the particular low hum of an installation coming online for the day. Voices down corridors, boots on concrete, the smell of institutional breakfast starting somewhere in the direction of the main hall. A young corporal pastor in the hallway nodded, kept walking. Nobody questioned why Captain Carter's wife was up before 6. She poured coffee and stood at the counter and thought about what she knew. 4 sensors down on the north face, degraded backup communications, power cycling intermittently through the secondary systems, single guard rotation at the main gate, radar display running with consistent flicker that the operators had normalized. The lights on the north perimeter flickering at 0200 in a pattern that was too regular for simple electrical fault. And the ridge. She had not stopped thinking about the ridge. She needed to get eyes on it, not from inside the wire, from outside, or at least from a high enough vantage point on the installation itself to understand what an observer up there could actually see, and more importantly, what they couldn't. Because that was the part people always missed. Everyone focused on what a sniper position could observe. Nobody thought hard enough about the blind spots, the places where movement could happen outside the shooter's line of sight, the seams in the coverage. Daniel found her in the common area at 6:20. He looked marginally more rested than the night before, which wasn't saying a great deal. He poured his own coffee and leaned against the counter beside her, and they stood together in the comfortable silence of two people who had been married long enough to not require constant conversation. "You sleep okay?" he asked finally. "Well enough," she said. He looked at her sideways. "You're already thinking." "I'm always thinking." "You're thinking about the base." He said it without accusation, just an observation. "I know that look." She turned to face him. "Daniel, walk me through a scenario." He set his mug down. "Rachel?" Not a briefing, just a conversation between a husband and a wife. She kept her voice low, easy. "If your main communications array went down right now completely, not partially, what's your response time to get backup systems operational?" He was quiet for a moment, a long moment, officially 15 minutes. And unofficially, he picked his mug back up, stared into it. "The backup systems have been cycling. When they cycle, there's a restart sequence, depending on where in the cycle they are when we need them." He paused. 30 minutes, maybe 40. 30 to 40 minutes with zero external communication. We'd still have internal comms, radios within the base. Your internal radio infrastructure runs through the same power system as the backup array. He looked at her. The look was not irritated. It was the look of a man who was starting to hear something he had been almost hearing for weeks and hadn't let himself fully receive. "How do you know that?" "I looked at the layout when we walked past the communications building yesterday. The cable routing through the west wall junction. If the power cycles on the backup array, your internal radio repeater goes down with it." Silence. "Daniel," she set her own mug down, "how long has the North radar been running at degraded function?" His jaw tightened. 3 weeks. "Has anyone escalated this above post level?" "We filed reports." "That's not what I asked." He turned away from her, walked to the window, stood there with his back to her, and she could see the shape of his shoulders and the way he was carrying something heavy in them, something that had been accumulating weight for weeks and hadn't had anywhere to go. "Command's assessment was that the issues are weather-related and within manageable parameters," he said. "We're a low-priority installation between operations. We're not supposed to be a high-risk position right now." Rachel picked up her coffee. "Who decided that? People above my pay grade." There it was again, that phrase. She had heard Pete say it yesterday and dismissed it as civilian casualness. Hearing Daniel say it was different. Hearing Daniel say it meant the assessment had filtered down from somewhere with enough authority that questioning it felt above the station of a captain running a mountain outpost between operations. She walked to him at the window, stood beside him, looked out at what he was looking at. "I want to take a walk this morning," she said. "Get some air, look around a little. I can arrange a tour." "I don't need a tour. I just want to walk." He looked at her. "Where?" "Around the perimeter, the south side, the east side." She paused deliberately. "Maybe up toward the high ground on the south face if there's a path." "There's a maintenance path up there for the relay equipment." "Perfect." He studied her for a long moment. The morning light from the window was hitting the side of her face, and he was looking at her the way he sometimes looked at her when she thought he wasn't looking, with a particular combination of love and uncertainty, like a man who had married someone he completely trusted and only occasionally fully understood. "Rachel, what do you think is happening here?" She met his eyes. "I think this base has been developing vulnerabilities for 3 weeks, and nobody above your pay grade has taken them seriously enough." She said it plainly, factually, no alarm in her voice, no drama. "And I think the combination of those vulnerabilities creates a window that a patient, organized threat actor could exploit." The word hung in the air between them. Daniel set his coffee down very carefully on the window ledge. "That's a significant assessment for For someone's wife, I know. She held his gaze. Walk me to the south maintenance path and then go to your briefing. I'll be back in an hour. He didn't move for a moment. Then he said, I'll walk you there. He walked her there without speaking. Through the eastern yard past the vehicle bays, she noted again that the secondary exit was still blocked into a narrow path that led upward toward the relay equipment on the south face. At the base of the path, he stopped. 1 hour, he said. 1 hour, she confirmed. She started up the path. After about 20 meters, she heard him call her name. She turned. He was standing at the base of the path with his hands in his jacket pockets, looking up at her, and his expression was something she didn't have a clean word for. You'd tell me if you knew something, he said, something specific. She looked at him for 3 full seconds. Yes, she said, I would tell you. She turned back to the path and kept walking. The maintenance path took her up the south face at a gradual angle past the relay equipment housing. She noted the model, the installation date on the maintenance placard, the fact that one of the housing seals had been improperly reseated after the last service, and higher until she reached a natural shelf in the rock about 40 meters above the base floor. She stopped there. She turned north, and she looked at the ridge. From this elevation, the geometry of the entire installation opened up beneath her. She could see everything, the patrol routes, the vehicle positions, the communications tower, the gap in the sensor grid on the north face. She could see exactly where the coverage failed, exactly where the blind spots were, and exactly how they lined up. Then she shifted her gaze upward to the north ridge proper. It was maybe 300 meters of elevation above the base, curving in a natural arc that created multiple natural firing positions with excellent concealment from below. The rock formations along the crest were irregular enough to provide cover for a shooter and a spotter. The angle of the sun at midday would put observers up there in shadow, while anyone on the base looking north would be looking into glare. She stood very still and studied the ridge for a long time. Then she saw it. Movement. Brief, small, disciplined. Not an animal. Animals didn't move in straight lateral lines across rock faces. Whatever she had just seen was tracking from east to west along a shelf about 50 meters below the crest. One deliberate, controlled motion, and then nothing. Gone. Back into stillness, so complete, it might have been her imagination. It was not her imagination. Her heart rate did not change. Her hands stayed still. She remained on the shelf for another 2 minutes, watching, letting her eyes rest in soft focus across the whole sweep of the ridge, rather than fixing on any one point. The trick of looking without staring. The thing you learned when looking too hard was the same as being blind. She saw nothing else. She turned and walked back down the path. She was back inside the wire in 38 minutes. She went directly to the communications building, not to the operators on duty. She stopped outside the door. Let her eyes move over the exterior, trace the cable conduits running along the outer wall, followed them to where they entered the building and to where they connected to the junction box on the west side that served both the main array and the backup systems. A single point of failure, one junction box. If that box went down, whether from power surge, targeted interference, or physical disruption, the entire communications infrastructure of FO Granite would drop simultaneously. Main and backup, internal and external. The base would go deaf and blind in the same instant. She walked back toward the officers' quarters, moving at an easy civilian pace, nodding to soldiers who passed her, looking for all the world like a woman taking a comfortable morning stroll. Inside, she was doing math. Distance from the north ridge to the junction box, approximately 260 meters at a slight downward angle, well within range for any trained shooter. The junction box was not armored. It was not in a protected position. It was, in fact, mounted on the exterior wall in a location that had probably seemed convenient when the base was designed and had remained unconsidered ever since. She found Sergeant Voss near the motor pool and stopped her with a friendly wave. Sergeant, quick question. Where's the armory on this base? Voss blinked. Ma'am, the armory isn't accessible to... I'm not trying to access it. I'm just curious about the layout. Rachel smiled. My husband gives terrible directions. I'm trying to find my way back to the main hall, and I think I went wrong somewhere. Voss relaxed instantly, smiled back. Oh, of course. The main hall is that way, she pointed. The armory's actually in the opposite direction near the north building. But you don't want to go that way, it's all restricted access. Of course, Rachel said. Thank you. She filed that away too. North building, near the wall that faced the ridge. Daniel found her in the officer's common room at 11. He sat down across from her and put both hands flat on the table. Tell me what you saw up there. She looked at him. Movement on the north ridge. The color shifted in his face. Not dramatically, just a subtle draining, the particular pallor of someone whose unnameable dread has just acquired a name. Rachel. One contact, moving laterally east to west, approximately 50 meters below the crest. Disciplined movement. Not an animal. He leaned forward. You're sure? I'm sure. That could be a dozen things. Hunters, hikers, local. In this temperature, at that elevation, moving in a straight, tactical line across exposed rock. She held his gaze. Daniel, I need you to trust what I'm telling you. He was quiet for a long moment, looked at his hands on the table. I can increase the patrol schedule. Put in a report too. A report won't help if they're already in position. What do you mean already in position? The lights at 200 last night. The pattern wasn't electrical fault. It was consistent with short-duration signal interference. Someone was running a test last night, testing the response, testing whether anyone noticed. She kept her voice level, kept her hands still on the table between them. They noticed that no one noticed. Daniel stood up from the table, moved away, turned around, came back, sat back down. Okay, he said. His voice had dropped half a register. Okay, what are you telling me? I'm telling you that someone has been studying this base for at least 3 weeks, that they have identified every vulnerability in your sensor grid and your communications infrastructure, that they have at least one individual in a position on the North Ridge, and that I don't think you have the kind of time that another report to command is going to address. She paused. I'm telling you to go to your XO right now and put the base on elevated readiness. He stared at her. On what basis do I justify that? My wife went for a walk and thought she saw something on a ridge. She met his eyes and said nothing. He ran both hands through his hair, stood again. Rachel, I believe you. Okay, I believe something is off. But I can't, he stopped. What am I supposed to tell my command that my wife has a bad feeling? Then tell them the sensors have been down for 3 weeks and the communications backup can't be relied upon, and those two facts alone justify elevated readiness. Her voice was still steady, still low, still completely controlled. The movement on the ridge is my read. The infrastructure failures are documented fact. Use the documented fact. He looked at her for a long time. She could see him fighting it, not fighting her, but fighting the institutional weight of assessments made by people above his pay grade, the friction of raising an alarm in a quiet period, the very real professional cost of calling a threat that didn't materialize. She knew exactly what that felt like. She had been inside that calculation herself more than once. Go, she said quietly. Right now, go talk to your XO. He went. She sat alone in the common room for 11 minutes. Long enough to run through the scenario 4 times in her head from 4 different angles, testing her own read, looking for the places where she might be wrong. She found a few, not enough. The weight of what she was seeing didn't shift toward a benign interpretation no matter how she turned it. Daniel came back at 11:43. He sat down heavily. XO says the sensor issues and comms degradation are documented and being addressed through proper channels. No basis for elevated readiness without a confirmed threat indicator. Rachel looked at him. And the movement on the ridge. He said, and I'm quoting exactly that, a civilian visitor is not a qualified intelligence source. The room was quiet. She nodded slowly. I'm sorry, Daniel said. Don't be. She stood up. Go do your afternoon briefing. Rachel. Go. She touched his arm once briefly. I'm fine. I'm going to sit here and read my book. He left. She listened to his footsteps until they were gone. Then she sat back down and she looked at the door of the common room and she thought about the armory in the north building and she thought about the ridge and she thought about the junction box on the west wall and she thought about the 45 to 60-minute window of degraded camera coverage on the north face every morning. And she thought about the test signal at 0200 that nobody had noticed except her. And she thought about the man she had seen moving across the rock face with the deliberate, measured patience of someone who was not moving toward anything yet. Someone who was getting into position. She thought about what getting into position meant. It meant the position was almost ready. It meant whatever came next was not weeks away. It was not days away. She picked up her paperback, opened it, stared at the words without reading them. At 1300 hours, she closed the book. She stood up from this table and walked to the window and looked out at the base and the sky above the ridge. And she understood not as a thought, but as a physical certainty that moved through her like a cold current, that she wasn't going to be reading her book this afternoon. Something was coming, and every minute between now and when it arrived was a minute she did not have the luxury of wasting. She had 40 minutes. She didn't know that yet, not precisely, but her body had already started its own internal countdown the moment she stood up from the table at 1300 and looked out at the ridge. The cold certainty she'd felt wasn't instinct in the vague, mystical sense that word sometimes implied. It was pattern recognition built on 8 years of reading terrain, reading behavior, reading the particular silence that preceded coordinated violence. That silence had a texture. She had learned its texture the hard way in places that didn't appear on civilian maps, and she was feeling that texture right now pressing against the inside of her chest like a held breath. She left the common room and walked to Daniel's office. He was at his desk with 2 other officers bent over a map mid-sentence about vehicle rotation schedules. He looked up when she appeared in the doorway. She didn't say anything. She looked at him for exactly 2 seconds with an expression she kept completely neutral, and then she stepped back into the hallway and waited. He came out in 30 seconds. He pulled the door halfway shut behind him. "What's wrong?" "I need you to do something for me, and I need you to do it right now without asking me to justify it." He went very still. "Rachel, I need you to get your soldiers off the north side of the base. Whatever reason you want to use maintenance rotation, change anything. Get them off the north face and get them into covered positions." He stared at her. "That's not a small ask." "I know. If I move personnel without—" "Daniel." She stepped closer to him and lowered her voice to almost nothing. "I saw 1 contact on the ridge this morning. I think there are more. I think they've been up there longer than this morning. And I think the window they've been waiting for is close." She held his eyes. "How long would it take to move your north face personnel to covered positions?" He was doing the calculation behind his eyes. She could see it. 10-12 minutes if I do it incrementally. If I do it all at once, it raises flags from everyone watching the base. Do it incrementally." She put her hand on his arm. "Start now. Don't run. Don't make noise. Just start rotating people, south and east, as naturally as you can." He looked at her hand on his arm, looked at her face. And she saw the moment he made the decision, not because he had confirmation, not because protocol supported it, but because he had been married to her for 9 years, and he had learned the way people learn things that live in the body rather than the mind that. When Rachel looked at him the way she was looking at him right now, the cost of disbelieving her was something he could not afford. "Okay," he said. He went back into his office. She heard him issue 3 sentences in an even unhurried voice to the officers inside. She didn't catch the specifics. She was already moving. She walked toward the north building. Not running, walking. The measured pace of someone who had somewhere to go and was getting there without making it anyone else's business. She passed 2 soldiers and nodded to both of them. One nodded back. One was looking at his phone and didn't notice her at all. She passed the motor pool, the secondary equipment shed, and came to the north building, the one Voss had told her housed the armory. She pushed through the outer door into the narrow corridor beyond. The armory door was a reinforced steel door with a combination lock and a secondary key mechanism. Standard installation setup. She stood in front of it for 3 seconds and thought about Daniel's combination. He had never directly told her, but she had seen him use it twice on their last base, and she had the kind of visual memory that photographs sequences of movement without making a conscious choice to do so. Right 14, left 27, right 9. She tried it. The lock clicked open. She stood there for a moment with her hand on the door and let out a slow breath. Then she pushed it open and stepped inside. The armory was not large. Standard complement for a base this size between operations. Rifles, sidearms, ammunition. A limited supply of heavier equipment toward the back. She moved through the racks with the efficiency of someone who had done this before in a different life, reading serial numbers, and conditioned by touch and sight simultaneously. She was not here for volume. She was here for one specific thing. She found it on the 3rd rack. A damaged MOM 110 semi-automatic sniper rifle. She could see immediately why it had been pulled from rotation. The scope mount had taken damage at some point, leaving the factory scope unusable. Someone had written "deadlined" on a strip of tape across the stock. But the barrel was clean and the action cycled smoothly when she worked it by hand. The rifle itself was functional. What it needed was a different optic. She looked at the adjacent shelf, found a set of iron sights and a parts kit. She had not used iron sights on a platform like this in 6 years. She thought about the distance to the ridge. She thought about the wind this morning, the direction, the velocity she'd estimated from the way the loose equipment tarp on the south side had been moving. She thought about the elevation differential. Iron sights would have to be enough. She found ammunition on the south wall, selected what she needed, and loaded 2 magazines with the systematic calm of a person doing something they have done so many times that the hands no longer need the mind's guidance. She pressed each round home by Phil's eyes already moving to the rest of the rack, cataloging what else was available and what might matter in the next hour. She had just chambered the first round when the door behind her opened. She spun. It was Sergeant Voss. Voss stood in the doorway with her hands still on the frame, looking at Rachel Carter, standing in the middle of the armory with a loaded M110 in her hands, and her face went through about 4 distinct expressions in 3 seconds: surprise, confusion, alarm, and then something harder to name. Her hand moved toward her radio. "Sergeant?" Rachel's voice was completely level. "I need you to listen to me for 60 seconds before you call anyone." Voss's hand stayed on her radio. "Ma'am, you need to put that weapon down right now." "I'm not going to do that, but I am going to talk to you because you're clearly not a stupid person, and what I have to tell you is important." Rachel kept the rifle lowered, muzzle down, non-threatening in its angle. "There is at least 1 confirmed contact on the North Ridge, possibly more. I believe this base is going to be hit, and I believe it's going to be hit in the next 30 minutes or less." Voss stared at her. "How do you—" "Because I've been watching this base since I arrived, and everything I've seen for 2 days points to a coordinated attack at a moment of communications failure." Rachel took 1 step toward her. "I know how that sounds. I know I'm a civilian, and this rifle is not mine to take. But I need you to make a choice right now about whether you're going to waste the next 3 minutes arresting me, or whether you're going to get on your radio and tell your duty officer that there may be contacts on the North Ridge." Voss's jaw was tight. Her hand was still on the radio. "Who are you, Tamao?" "My name is Rachel Carter. I am Captain Daniel Carter's wife." She paused. "And before that, I was a Marine Scout sniper. 8 years. 143 confirmed kills." She let that sit in the air between them for exactly 1 second. "Get on your radio, Sergeant." Voss grabbed her radio. Her eyes didn't leave Rachel. "This is Sergeant Voss Communications Building, requesting duty officer contact possible threat indicator north." The explosion hit before she finished the sentence. The sound was not what most people imagine when they thought about an explosion. It was not a Hollywood roar. It was a concussive punch, a compression wave that arrived before the sound itself, a physical force that hit the outer wall of the north building and traveled through the structure in a fraction of a second, knocking equipment off shelves, slamming the armory door against its frame. The floor vibrated. The lights in the corridor outside flickered and went to emergency backup. Voss grabbed the wall. Her radio erupted with voices. Rachel was already moving. "North building, take cover," she said to Voss without stopping. "Stay low, stay away from exterior walls." Then she pushed past her into the corridor and toward the exit. She hit the outer door and the world outside was already different from the one she had left 40 seconds ago. Smoke was coming from the northern perimeter, black and heavy, the kind that came from military-grade incendiaries rather than equipment fires. She could hear small arms fire, sharp and rapid, from at least 2 elevated positions. She could hear shouting in multiple directions and the particular vocal quality of men who had been caught in transition, not fully asleep, not fully ready, but somewhere in the terrible middle ground. She moved along the wall of the north building, keeping her profile tight against the structure, and assessed. The northern perimeter was taking fire from 2 positions on the ridge. She identified them by the muzzle flash signatures, the angle of tracer rounds coming in from above the pattern of impact craters in the dirt and concrete. One position was high and center on the ridge. One was slightly lower and to the east. Both had clear sight lines into the main installation yard. In the main yard, soldiers were moving, some with direction, some without. She could see a sergeant trying to organize a fire team near the vehicle bay, But the secondary exit was still blocked by the vehicle arrangement she had noted yesterday, and the team was bottlenecked trying to force two vehicles past each other in a space that wasn't designed for it. She could see the communications building. One of its exterior walls had taken shrapnel damage. The junction box on the west side, the single point of failure she had identified 2 days ago, was dark. Physically dark, which meant it was destroyed or disabled. FOB Granite was already blind. She heard a sound from above and her eyes went up instinctively. A drone. Small commercial grade modified. It was circling at about 60 meters, moving in a slow arc over the center of the installation. It was not armed, she could tell by its size and flight pattern, but it was feeding video. Someone on that ridge was watching everything that moved on this base in real time. She felt something cold and precise click into place inside her chest. Not fear. She had been afraid before she knew exactly what fear felt like in her body, the nausea and the shaking and the desperate desire to be somewhere else. This was not that. This was the opposite of that. This was the thing that came after fear was done. The narrowing, the clarity, the world reduced to geometry and timing, and the distance between where she was and where she needed to be. She needed the high ground. The south-face maintenance path was 130 meters to her left. She would be exposed for portions of that distance. The drone was watching. If the drone operator understood what he was seeing, a civilian-looking person moving purposefully toward high ground with a rifle, he would redirect attention to her position. She had maybe 90 seconds before someone on that ridge figured out what she was doing. She started running, not sprinting blindly. Running with control, cutting angles using every piece of cover the installation offered the equipment, shed the motor pool wall, the parked vehicles along the eastern edge, moving in the pattern of someone who had planned a route through a base they had been memorizing since the moment they arrived. Because that was exactly what she had been doing. She heard a burst of fire crack past the east wall. The fire team at the vehicle bay finally got one vehicle moved and pushed through the gap too slowly, too noisily, drawing a sustained burst from the eastern ridge position that forced them back into cover. She was past the motor pool. She heard Daniel's voice from somewhere in the direction of the command center. Shouting orders, she recognized the specific cadence of his command voice, the one he used when things were going wrong, but he hadn't yet lost control of the situation. He was still functional. He was still in it. That was good. She hit the base of the maintenance path at a dead run and started climbing. The path was narrow and the footing was uncertain. Frozen ground, loose gravel in patches. Places where the previous night's temperature had created ice over stone. She moved through it without slowing weight forward, hands free, the rifle across her back on a sling she'd improvised from equipment webbing in the armory. The smoke from the northern perimeter was drifting south on the wind, and it helped her partially obscured from below, partially obscured from the north ridge. She was 30 meters up the path when she heard the drone change pitch above her. It had found her. She didn't look up. Looking up would tell whoever was watching the drone feed exactly where to direct rifle fire. She kept moving, pressed close to the rock face on her right, cutting the angle of her exposure from the north, and climbed. 50 meters. A burst of rifle fire from somewhere on the ridge sent rounds sparking off the rock face above her. Not accurate, whoever fired it was adjusting, trying to find her. She changed her angle, moved right, used a natural fold in the terrain she had noted during her morning reconnaissance as a partial defilade position. The round stopped. She kept climbing. 70 meters. The shelf she had stood on this morning, the natural platform with the sight line to the north, was 5 meters above her now. She could see its edge. She could see the open sky above it. She heard a sound she recognized immediately. The distinctive percussive cough of a mortar. Not a large tube, something man-portable, something that had been carried up that ridge and set up while no one was paying attention. She heard the round in the air, the specific whistle of its descent, and then felt the impact shake the mountain through her boots as it hit somewhere inside the base perimeter below. She did not stop. She came over the edge of the shelf and dropped flat, the rifle already coming off her back and into her hands in one practice motion that lived in muscle memory years deep. She got her elbows down, got her body into a stable prone position, and brought the rifle up. Through the iron sights, the north ridge resolved from a distant feature into a specific landscape of rock and shadow. She was looking at approximately 290 meters of distance, slightly upward angle, with a left-to-right crosswind she estimated at 8 to 12 miles per hour, based on the movement of smoke below her and the flag on the communications tower now hanging limp because the tower had taken damage, which changed her wind read. She adjusted. Below her, the base was in serious trouble. She could hear it even without seeing it directly. The volume of incoming fire had increased. Two separate machine gun positions now cycling through targets in the installation yard, systematic and coordinated. The mortar had been accurate. Whoever was running this operation from the ridge was calling adjustments in real time through the drone feed. Every defender who moved was a target. Every piece of cover was already plotted. She found the first position through the sights. The machine gunner higher left, protected by a natural rock parapet on three sides, but open on the fourth, open to someone positioned below and to the south, which was exactly where she was. She took 3 slow breaths, in through the nose, out through the mouth, the old rhythm, the one she had told herself she would never use again. She let the third breath out halfway and held. She squeezed. The shot broke, and the machine gun went silent in the same instant. Below her in the base, something changed. Not silence, the base was far from silent, but the particular quality of the incoming fire shifted. One of the 2 machine gun positions was gone. The coordinated pressure that had been pinning the defenders into their current positions broke along one axis, and she heard even from here the sound of voices reorganizing. People finding room to move. She was already working the bolt. She was already finding the next position. She had 8 more rounds in the magazine. She thought about what she needed to do with each one of them. She thought about the drone circling above, still circling, still transmitting, and about the mortar team that would be adjusting their tube right now, having heard her shot, trying to calculate her position. She thought about the command Overwatch sniper she had identified in her morning reconnaissance as the most likely position on the ridge crest, the one who was running this entire operation, watching the drone feed and calling coordinates to the mortar team and the rifle squads below. She had gotten very lucky with the first shot, the surprise, the angle, the momentary gap in their awareness. She would not get lucky twice. What she had was skill, 8 years of it, and she was going to need every single day of those 8 years in the next few minutes. She shifted her position 6 feet to the right, always move after a shot, always change the geometry, got her elbows back down, brought the sights back up, and began searching the ridge crest for the Overwatch position. She found something, and what she found stopped her breath for 1/2 second before discipline snapped back in, and she kept her eyes steady and her hands still. There were not 2 positions on that ridge. There were at least 4, and they were all converging on the southern face. They were converging on her. 4 positions converging on her location. Rachel processed that information in the span of a single breath and made her decision before the breath was done. Moving was the wrong call. Moving meant exposure, meant crossing open ground, while 4 trained shooters were already adjusting to her position, meant giving the drone operator exactly the kind of isolated target he was waiting to hand off to the mortar team. Staying meant turning a defensive problem into an offensive one. It meant making them come to her instead of letting them dictate the geometry. She stayed. She moved 3 feet left instead of retreating, pressing herself into the natural fold of rock she had identified during her morning walk, the one that cut her exposure from the north by roughly 40%. She got her elbows back down, she breathed, and she began working through the problem the way she had been trained to work through problems, when everything was moving fast and the math was against you, and panic was the one option you could not afford. Priority targets first, always. The drone was still circling. As long as it was feeding, whoever was commanding this assault could see every move she made and every move the defenders below made. The drone was not her highest priority. She couldn't take it with the M11. Oh, iron sights at this range without wasting rounds she couldn't replace, but it was the thread running through everything. Cut the thread and the whole operation went partially blind. She didn't have a shot on the drone operator yet. She had a shot on the mortar team. She had found them 3 seconds after she identified the 4 converging positions, a 2-man team set up on a flat shelf 60 meters below the ridge crest northeast of her position. They were in the process of adjusting their tube, working from a spotter behind them who was reading the drone feed off a handheld device and calling corrections in a low, quick voice she could not hear, but could read in the physical dynamic between the 3 men. Spotter talks, tube adjusts. Spotter talks, tube adjusts. If she took the spotter, the tube went blind. Without real-time correction from the drone feed, the mortar team was working on math and memory. They'd need at least a minute to reestablish targeting reference. 1 minute. She had learned a long time ago what you could do with 1 minute if you used it right. She shifted her aim point to the spotter. Adjusted for wind, the smoke from the northern perimeter had shifted direction in the last 4 minutes, which told her the wind had backed around about 15 degrees. She recalculated, moved her point of aim fractionally right, held on the spotter's back where he was bent over the handheld device, and let half a breath go. The shot broke clean. The spotter went down. The mortar team froze for exactly the 2 seconds that trained fighters freeze. When the unexpected arrives, 2 seconds of pure biological override before training kicked back in and they started moving. But 2 seconds was what she needed. In those 2 seconds, she worked the bolt, found the tube operator through the sights, and fired again. The mortar went silent. Below her, the base changed again. She could hear it without seeing it directly, the incoming mortar fire that had been walking across the installation yard, destroying equipment and wounding soldiers, simply stopped. And in that silence, she heard Daniel's voice rise above the noise with a clarity that told her he had just registered the change and was using it. Fire team, 2 move now. Eastern wall move. Good, he was moving people into the gap she'd just opened. She shifted right again. 3 feet, new angle, new cover. She had 4 rounds left in the first magazine. She needed to be surgical. The 4 converging positions had paused when she took out the mortar team. That pause lasted about 8 seconds, she counted, and then they adapted. 2 of the 4 positions held presumably covering, while the other 2 began moving. Leapfrogging, bound and overwatch. These were not militia fighters. These were trained operators who had absorbed a surprise from an unexpected direction and were responding with practiced professional discipline. She felt a specific cold respect for that, and then she used it against them. Trained fighters moving in bound and overwatch patterns were predictable in their timing. The covering element held still, while the moving element advanced, then the roles reversed. If you knew the rhythm, and she knew the rhythm, she had run that pattern herself hundreds of times, you could predict exactly when the covering element would shift position, because the moment the moving element reached its next cover position was the moment the covering element became the priority. She waited. She watched the rock face above her through the iron sights. She counted. 7 seconds, 8, 9. She saw the movement in the figure shifting position, transitioning from cover to the next bound point body, moving in the brief exposed window between one piece of rock and the next. She fired. The figure went down. The remaining 3 positions froze again. She used the freeze, moved immediately 6 feet right, this time pushing the limit of the rock shelf, but staying prone, staying below the shelf edge, making herself as small as possible, while changing her geometry enough that anyone trying to calculate her position from the previous muzzle flash would be off by enough meters to matter. A burst of rifle fire came across the shelf edge above her. Close. Searching. Not accurate, they were firing on her last known position, trying to suppress her while they adjusted. She pressed flat and let the burst go by and thought very clearly and quickly about the next 30 seconds. She had 3 rounds in the first magazine. She had a second magazine on the sling mount, 12 rounds total remaining after this magazine ran dry. Below her, the base was still in a fight. She could hear sustained fire from the north perimeter. She could hear Sergeant Voss's voice on a radio somewhere below. She could hear the sound of a vehicle engine starting and then being suppressed by fire almost immediately. Someone was trying to get a vehicle to a casualty and being prevented. She needed to break the remaining firing position's confidence, not just neutralize them, break them, make them feel what it felt like to be on the receiving end of a shooter they couldn't locate and couldn't suppress, because that feeling, the particular psychological erosion of sustained fire from an unknown position, was itself a force multiplier. It made fighters stop moving. It made them go to ground and stay there. And fighters who had stopped moving were fighters who were no longer coordinating. She switched magazines. Smooth automatic, the hands doing what the hands knew without consulting the mind. Then she heard something that changed her calculus completely. A voice. Male. Talking on a radio not more than 30 meters above her on the ridge face, speaking in English. Southern shooter confirmed position at the maintenance shelf. One person. Look civilian. A pause. Yes, civilian appearing, no uniform. Another pause and then something that sent a specific, precise kind of cold through her chest. Confirmed female. She's the wife. They knew who she was. They had been watching the base long enough to know who had arrived when she had arrived and what she looked like. The surveillance that had preceded this attack was not just tactical, it was thorough, which meant either someone had fed them information from inside or they had eyes on this installation at a level of sophistication that went well beyond a standard ambush. She filed that away for later. Right now, it meant one thing practically: they were not going to ignore her. The man on the radio was issuing a specific instruction to deal with her specifically. She had maybe 90 seconds before that instruction reached whoever was closest to her position. She stopped being defensive. She went looking for the man on the radio. He was giving himself away with every transmission. The voice was coming from a fixed point, which meant he was stationary, which meant he was the command element. The Overwatch commander she had identified in her morning reconnaissance as the linchpin of the entire operation. If he was still running this assault by voice, she had not yet neutralized him, which meant the attack's coordination was still intact despite everything she had done. She needed the command element. She found him. He was tucked into a crevice on the ridge face about 30 meters above her and 15 meters to the right. He was nearly invisible from below. He would have been completely invisible to anyone on the base, but from her position on the maintenance shelf, looking upward at a specific angle she had arrived at by triangulating his voice to 3 separate transmission points, she could see the slight protrusion of a rifle barrel and the edge of a boot. The shot was difficult, upward angle significant. Wind had shifted again. The iron sights gave her no magnification, which meant she was working with a small target at an awkward angle, with open sights at a range that was right at the edge of what she would have attempted even with a proper scope. She thought about not taking it. She thought about it for exactly 2 seconds, which was 1 second of genuine evaluation and 1 second of the deeply trained refusal to let difficulty become excuse. She took it. The rifle cracked and the boot disappeared and the radio voice stopped. Just stopped. Mid-sentence, whatever he had been saying had stopped. And the effect cascaded faster than she had expected. Without the command voice, without the drone feed being actively interpreted and transmitted to all positions simultaneously, the assault on FOB Granite lost its coherence with a speed that told her exactly how much of its structure had depended on that single man's direction. The incoming fire from the northern perimeter became intermittent. Then it became sparse. The 2 remaining positions above her, which had been maneuvering toward her with professional coordination 30 seconds ago, went to ground and stayed there. She didn't wait to see what they would do next. She came up from prone to a kneeling position, still partially covered by the rock shelf edge, and looked down at the base below her. What she saw made her throat tighten. They were wounded in the yard. She could see 2 soldiers down being dragged toward the medical building by their teammates. She could see the communications building with a hole in its north wall. She could see the vehicle bay with one of the vehicles burning black smoke pouring from it into the afternoon sky. She could see Daniel and the sight of him upright and moving and issuing orders from a position near the command center unlocked something in her chest that she hadn't realized had been locked. He was alive. He was okay. She let herself have that for exactly 1 second. Then she looked back up at the ridge. The drone was still circling, but it was losing altitude. Either the operator had been hit or he was deliberately bringing it down because the command element was gone and he was trying to recover his equipment. Either way, the drone's surveillance value was degrading rapidly. She had 6 rounds left. She heard a sound from the base below, a voice she recognized as the XO, the one who had told Daniel that a civilian wasn't a qualified intelligence source. He was on a radio now, and his voice had a quality that was entirely different from his earlier measured dismissal. He was calling in their situation. External communication was back somewhere. Somehow one of the operators had restored partial function to the communications array. Whatever backup link they'd managed to jury-rig was thin and unstable, but it was enough. Help had been called. She brought her attention back to the ridge. The 2 remaining positions above her were still static. She watched them. Watched the micro-movements, the slight shifts of weight, the barely perceptible head adjustments of men trying to decide whether to press forward, hold, or withdraw. She read them the way she had been trained to read the body language of fighters at distance through a scope or without one through smoke or shadow. They were deciding to withdraw. She could feel it in the way their movement patterns had changed. The aggressive forward lean was gone. The heads were angling rearward. They were done fighting. They were starting to think about getting off this mountain. She let them start thinking about it. Then she made a choice that went against the pure tactical calculus and came entirely from a different place. The place that knew that men retreating in panic made more noise and more errors than men retreating in confidence. And that more noise and more errors meant more actionable information for whoever arrived at this base in the next 40 minutes. She fired twice more into the rock face between them, not at them, between them, close enough that the impact debris would hit them, close enough that they would feel it as targeting rather than proximity error. The effect was immediate. Both positions broke and ran. Not in the careful bound and over watch pattern of professional fighters maintaining discipline. They ran. Exposed fast making noise moving in the particular graceless urgency of people who have stopped thinking tactically and started thinking only about distance. She watched them go and thought, good. Run. And when someone finds you, and they will find you, you will have a great deal to explain. She lowered the rifle. Her arms were shaking. She had not noticed that until this moment. The shaking was not fear. It was the deferred physical cost of sustained adrenaline, the body presenting its invoice after the transaction was complete. Her hands, which had been so still for so long, were trembling with a fine, rapid vibration that she watched with the detached curiosity of someone observing a phenomenon in someone else's body. She pressed them flat against the rock surface below her and breathed slowly until the trembling stopped. Below her, the base was changing. The fire from the northern perimeter had gone fully quiet. The smoke was still rising, but no new fires were starting. She could hear voices, organizing not the fragmented, panicked voices of men in disarray, but the beginning of the hard, practical rhythm of soldiers accounting for themselves and their people in the aftermath. She started down the maintenance path. Her legs were steady. Her mind was very quiet. The particular quality of quiet that came after sustained concentration of that intensity, not emptiness, but a kind of scrubbed cleanness, like a room after all, the furniture has been moved and cleaned under. She was 40 meters down the path when she heard boots running toward her from below. Daniel came around the bend in the path at a pace that was not quite running and not quite walking the particular driven stride of a person who had been held in place by responsibility and had broken free the moment the calculus changed. He was still in his uniform, a cut above his left temple that had bled down the side of his face and dried, and he had his sidearm drawn, though he had it pointed at the ground. He saw her. He stopped. She stopped. They looked at each other across 15 meters of frozen mountain path, with the full weight of the last 40 minutes sitting between them, and neither of them said anything for a moment that stretched in ways that had nothing to do with its actual duration. Then he said, "You're hit." She looked down at her left arm. Her sleeve was torn, and there was blood. She hadn't felt it, hadn't noticed it, but there it was. A graze. Shrapnel or rock fragment from one of the bursts that had come across the shelf edge. Not deep, not dangerous, but real. "I didn't notice," she said. He holstered his sidearm and covered the distance between them in 5 steps and put both hands on her face, looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before, or maybe she had once a long time ago and had forgotten what it looked like. His hands were shaking against her cheeks. "Are you?" "I'm okay," she said. "Rachel." His voice broke on her name, just a single syllable fractured somewhere in the middle. "Rachel, who are you?" She looked at him. The question was real. He was not asking rhetorically. He was not asking with anger or accusation. He was standing on a mountain path with his hands on the face of the woman he had been married to for 9 years, and asking with complete sincerity who she was, because the person who had just climbed this path alone with a damaged rifle and done what she had done was not the woman he thought he knew. Or maybe she was exactly that woman, and he was only now understanding what that meant. She put her hands over his. "I'm the woman who married you," she said. That part was always real. He pulled her in and held her the way he had held her when she arrived, but completely differently. Not the careful hug of a husband reuniting with a wife he was happy to see. Something rawer than that. Something that had no name except need. She let him hold her for exactly 4 seconds. Then she pulled back. "Your soldiers need you," she said. He looked at her, nodded once, slow and deep. "We need to talk," he said. "We will. Everything, all of it." She looked at him steadily. "Everything, all of it. I promise." She touched his face once. "Go." He went. She watched him head back down the path, his shoulders straightening as he descended, the weight of command resettling onto them, the husband receding and the officer returning. She understood that. She had her own version of it. She followed him down at a slower pace. The base was in controlled recovery now. Medical personnel were moving. Perimeter teams were reestablishing positions. Someone had gotten a vehicle to the north wall, and soldiers were securing the breach points with the grim, efficient purposefulness of people who have absorbed a shock and are processing it through action. She passed through all of it, and nobody stopped her, which surprised her until she realized that everyone who looked at her looked away quickly, with the particular averted gaze of people who are not sure how to categorize what they are seeing and have chosen for now to deal with that uncertainty later. Sergeant Voss was at the communications building when Rachel came past. She was on a radio calling status to someone, and she looked up when she saw Rachel and stopped mid-sentence. She finished her transmission, lowered the radio, and looked at Rachel for a long moment with an expression that was not quite anything Rachel had a word for. 143, Voss said. Rachel stopped. That's what you told me, Voss said. In the armory, 143 confirmed kills. Yes, Voss nodded slowly, not agreeing with something, processing something. I've been in the Army 11 years, she said. I've never seen anything like what I just watched from this position. Rachel didn't respond. Voss looked at her for another moment, then she raised the radio again. I need to go back to work, she said. But ma'am, she paused. Thank you. Rachel walked away. She found a low wall near the eastern building and sat down on it, out of the way of the organized chaos around her, and set the rifle across her knees. She looked at her left arm. The graze was longer than she had initially assessed, about 4 inches of torn skin along the outer forearm, bleeding slowly and steadily, in the way that minor wounds do when the adrenaline that suppressed them starts receding. She would need it cleaned and dressed. She would get to that. Right now, she sat with the rifle across her knees and looked at FOB Granite in the aftermath of what had just happened, and felt the thing she always felt after combat. The thing nobody ever talked about, honestly. The thing that sat underneath all the other things. Not triumph, not relief exactly, though those were there. Something deeper and more complicated. The feeling of a person who has returned to something they left behind and discovered that leaving it behind was never as complete as they needed it to be. She was 41 years old. She had been out of the Marines for 6 years. She had built a life that looked like peace, and it was peace. She was not discounting it. It was real, and it mattered. But the 6 years had not changed the underlying architecture of who she was. The architecture that had looked at a flickering radar screen and a misaligned antenna array in a north-facing ridge, and had known in the way, the temperature of water before you put your hand in it. What was building? She had tried to tell them. Nobody above someone's pay grade had listened. She sat with the rifle across her knees and the wind cold on her face, and she thought about that. About the 9 years she had been Rachel Carter, wife of Captain Daniel Carter, woman in civilian clothes, person with a paperback book, in a wool hat, in a plausible, comfortable story about just coming to see her husband. She thought about how much of herself had lived inside that story, and how much of herself had always been sitting just outside it waiting. She thought about what Daniel had asked her on the mountain path. Who are you? She thought she might need a long time to fully answer that question. Not because she didn't know, because the answer was more complicated than either of them had understood when they got married, and the complexity deserved more than a mountain path in the aftermath of a firefight. She heard a helicopter in the distance. She looked up, then she looked back down at the rifle. She had promised Daniel everything, all of it, the stories she had given partial answers to, the missions that didn't appear on civilian maps, the 8 years and the 143. The reason she had known before she arrived that something was wrong. The reason she had never fully stopped watching ridgelines. She owed him all of that. She was not afraid of giving it to him. What she was sitting on this wall, in the cold wind with the rifle across her knees and the sounds of a base recovering around her, was tired. Not the kind of tired that sleep fixes. The kind that accumulated over years of carrying something at a frequency that most people around you couldn't hear, couldn't feel, didn't know was there. She looked at her hands. They were still again, completely, utterly still. She didn't know if that was strength or simply the absence of something she had used up. She didn't know which answer she preferred. She pressed her palms flat on the cold surface of the rifle stock and held them there and breathed the thin mountain air and let herself exist inside the complexity of being exactly who she was. The helicopter was getting louder, reinforcements arriving at the perimeter, voices calling out positions and status. The base coming back to life around her slowly and perfectly, with the particular mixture of relief and grief that always followed survival. She sat in the middle of all of it, and for the first time since she had gotten into Pete's truck 4 days ago and started watching the ridgeline, she allowed herself to be completely, entirely still. The helicopter landed at 14:52. Rachel was still sitting on the low wall near the eastern building when it touched down, and she watched the response team pour out of it with the practiced efficiency of people who had been briefed in the air and hit the ground already knowing their assignments. 8 soldiers, 2 medics, 1 man in civilian clothes who moved like he was neither military nor not military, that particular in-between posture of someone whose authority didn't come from rank. He walked through the controlled chaos of FOB Granite's recovery with his hands in his jacket pockets and his eyes moving across everything cataloging. And when those eyes reached Rachel sitting on the wall with the M11 across her knees and her left sleeve soaked through with dried blood, he stopped. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he walked toward the command center without acknowledging her, and Rachel understood that the acknowledgement would come later in a room with a door and that it would not be casual. She stood up, carried the rifle to where Sergeant Voss was coordinating near the communications building, and held it out. This needs to go back to the armory. Voss took it, looked at Rachel. I'll log it as field requisitioned under emergency authorization. You'll log it however you need to log it, Rachel said. That's your job, not mine. Voss almost smiled. Not quite. Yes, ma'am. Rachel went to the medical station and let one of the medics clean and dress the graze on her forearm without making conversation about how it happened. The medic was young, maybe 22, and he worked with focused, careful hands and did not ask questions that were above his pay grade, and Rachel appreciated that more than she could have easily explained. When he finished, she sat in the medical station for a few minutes and let herself breathe. The final count as she would piece it together over the next several hours was this: 7 enemy killed on the ridge, 2 of them confirmed by her shots with the additional 5 attributed to the defensive response that regained momentum after her fire suppressed the command element. 4 soldiers wounded at FOB Granite, none killed, which was the number that mattered most and which everyone who heard it in the following days would understand as a near thing. A number that very easily could have been different. The mortar team had walked 2 rounds into the installation yard before Rachel neutralized them. 2 more had impacted the northern perimeter wall. The communications array had been partially restored within 20 minutes of the attack ending, enough to call in the response and enough to begin relaying the situation to command. The investigation into how a threat of that sophistication had developed undetected for 3 weeks would take considerably longer than 20 minutes to resolve. Daniel found her in the medical station at 15:20. He came in and sat across from her and looked at her arm and looked at her face, and neither of them spoke for almost a full minute. She let him have the silence. She understood what it was for. He was doing what people did after the immediate crisis passed. He was running the mental film backward, replaying every moment from the past 48 hours through a new lens. And the picture it made was very different from the one he had been looking at before. They want to talk to you, he said finally. I know. The man who came off the helicopter. His name is Garrett. Daniel paused. He said he knew you. Rachel was quiet. Did he? Daniel asked. We were in the same operational theater, she said, a long time ago. How long ago? Before we met. Daniel nodded slowly. He put his elbows on his knees and laced his fingers together and looked at the floor. Rachel, how much of what you've told me about those years, your service, the reason you got out, how much of that was true? She looked at him carefully. Not defensively, just with the attention the question deserved. Everything I told you about why I got out was true. I was exhausted. I had done what I could do, and I wanted something that wasn't the inside of a scope. She paused. What I didn't tell you was the full picture of what I had been doing for 8 years, what I was trained to do, what my record was. 143, he said quietly. Yes. He unfolded his hands and pressed them flat on his knees. Why didn't you tell me? Because I was trying to be someone different. She said it without apology, but also without defense, just plainly. Not someone fake, someone new. Someone who could sit in a kitchen and drink coffee and not read every room she walked into like a battlefield. She looked at her bandaged arm. I got about 70% of the way there. He made a sound that was not quite a laugh, rough at the edges. 70%, maybe 75 on good days. He looked up at her. His eyes were tired and honest and full of something she recognized as love, even though it was currently wearing the particular face that love wore when it had just been startled out of a shape it thought it understood. I'm not angry, he said. I know you're not. He stopped, started again. I don't know what I am yet. I think I need a few days to figure out what I am. That's fair, she said, but I need you to know, he leaned forward, what you did today. Up on that ridge, Rachel, you saved this base. You saved my soldiers. You possibly saved me. His voice was controlled, but the control was work. She could hear the effort in it. And I didn't know. I have been married to you for 9 years, and I didn't know you could do that. She looked at him. You knew I was someone you could trust. Yes. You knew I saw things other people didn't see. Yes. You knew that when I told you something was wrong, it was worth listening to. She held his eyes. The rest is detail. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, pretty significant detail. Yes, she agreed. It is. He reached across the space between them and took her unbandaged hand, held it, not saying anything further, just holding it the way people hold things they are afraid of losing. She let him. The conversation with Garrett happened at 1700 in a room that had been hastily cleared of its usual function and set up with 2 chairs and a folding table. Garrett was a compact man in his early 50s with gray at his temples and the kind of stillness that Rachel recognized as trained rather than natural, the same stillness she carried herself, the stillness of someone who had learned to make silence do work. He had a folder on the table, but he didn't open it. He looked at her for a moment when she sat down. Then he said, "You look good, Carter." "You look exactly the same," she said, which is unsettling. He almost smiled, almost. "How's the arm functional?" "Good." He put both hands on the table. "I'm going to ask you some things, and I need complete answers. I'll give you what I can give you." "You'll give me everything," he said. "Not hard, just factual." The tone of someone who was not making a threat but was being very precise about the nature of the situation. "Starting with how you identified the threat." She told him. All of it, the sensors, the communications infrastructure, the junction box, the patrol timing, the lights at 0200, the movement on the ridge. She told it in sequence in the flat, precise language of an after-action report without editorializing and without omitting. He didn't take notes. He didn't need to. She could tell by the way he listened that he was recording it in whatever internal filing system had made him valuable enough to be on a helicopter in under 2 hours from wherever he had come from. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "You went up the south maintenance path alone." "Yes." "With a deadlined M110 and iron sights." "It was what was available." He looked at her. 7 kills from that position. "That's the number being used." "Is it accurate?" "Close enough." Garrett picked up the folder, opened it, slid a single page across the table toward her. She looked at it without touching it. It was a brief, short, heavily redacted, the kind of document that existed in that particular gray administrative space between official and deniable. She read it in about 45 seconds. She looked up. "No." "Rachel." "No," she said again, cleanly, without heat. "I'm not coming back in." "Nobody's asking you to come back in." He pulled the page back. "We're asking you to consult, periodically, on a voluntary basis." That's how it always starts. He conceded that with a slight tilt of his head. "What happened today?" "What happened today was a one-time thing," she said. "I was here because my husband is here, and I knew something was wrong. I was right. It's over." "The people who put that operation together didn't build it in 3 weeks," Garrett said. "They had infrastructure in place before the attack. Surveillance logistics inside knowledge of this installation's vulnerabilities. We are going to need to understand how that network operates and where it extends." He paused. "Your read on threat indicators is stop." She held up her unbandaged hand. "I know what my read is. That's not why I'm saying no." "Then why?" She looked at him steadily. "Because I made a promise to myself when I got out that I would build a life that had room for things other than this, a marriage, a home, a future that wasn't measured in operational windows. She paused, and I've been partially breaking that promise every single day for 6 years without fully admitting it because I could never fully turn off the part of me that does what I did today. But I can choose not to feed it. I can choose to let it be what it is, something I carry without making it the center of everything again. Garrett looked at her for a long time. And if the next base doesn't have someone like you inside the wire, she met his eyes, then you need to fix the bases. You need to fix the sensors and the communications and the single points of failure and the command cultures that tell captains their documented vulnerability assessments are above everyone's pay grade. Her voice stayed even, but something in it sharpened at the edges. What happened here didn't happen because there was no one like me available. It happened because people with the authority to act on documented evidence chose not to. She let that sit. Fix that problem. Don't build your solution around finding the next me. Garrett closed the folder. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I'm going to put what you did today in a report that will be classified at a level that means almost nobody will ever read it. I know. Officially, the defensive response at FOB Granite will be credited to the soldiers who held the perimeter. Good, she said. They should get the credit. They held under serious pressure. Your name will appear in a footnote, civilian contractor, temporary augmentation. That's fine. He stood. She stood. He looked at her one more time, and the look had something in it that was not quite professional, a flicker of something older and more personal, the look of someone who had known her in a context where the person sitting across from him today was the person she had always been, without the civilian clothes and the paperback book and the carefully constructed normal life. You were always one of the best I ever worked with, he said. That doesn't go away. I know it doesn't, she said. That's the part I've had to learn to live with. He left. She stood in the empty room for a moment and looked at the wall and felt the full weight of the day settle onto her, in the way weight settled after the body stopped moving completely, and all at once with no more adrenaline to distribute it. She was 41 years old, and she had just done something she thought she had permanently retired from doing, and her arm hurt, and her husband was processing a fundamental reassessment of his understanding of the person he had married. And somewhere on a ridge above this base, there were men who had known her name before the first shot was fired. She thought about that last part. They had known who she was. Someone had told them, not necessarily someone inside this base, maybe a surveillance thread that went further back. Maybe something connected to her history rather than Daniel's present. Maybe both. She didn't know. Garrett would work that thread. It was his job now, not hers. She told herself that firmly and walked out of the room. Daniel was waiting in the corridor. He had changed his uniform and cleaned the blood from the cut at his temple, and he looked like a captain again, rather than a man who had been in a firefight except for his eyes, which still had the particular residual intensity that combat left behind and didn't scrub off with a change of clothes. He straightened when she came out of the room. How was it? He asked. It was fine. Are they? No, she said. I'm not going back in. I told him no. Something moved across his face, not relief exactly. Something more layered than that, the expression of a man absorbing information that was simultaneously reassuring and complicated. Okay, he said. Daniel. She stopped in front of him. I need to tell you things. The full version of things I gave you partial answers to before. Not tonight. Tonight is not the right time for either of us. But soon. Soon, he repeated. And I need you to understand that what I tell you doesn't change what's been real between us. It adds to it. It fills in gaps. But the 9 years are the 9 years. He looked at her for a moment. Then he reached out and carefully, gently touched the edge of the bandage on her forearm. Just touched the edge of it with 2 fingers. Who were you before I met you? He asked, not accusingly, with genuine quiet wonder. She thought about that for a moment. Someone who was very good at surviving, she said, and very lonely. He nodded, slowly, deeply. And now, less lonely, she said, still good at surviving, apparently. He made the sound again, the rough, not quite laugh. This time it was more fully a laugh. It broke something open in the air between them that needed to be broken. She felt her own chest loosen. He put his arm around her carefully on account of her arm, and they walked together down the corridor and out into the cold evening air of FOB Granite. The base was in recovery, soldiers moving with purpose. The communications tower was being assessed by a technical team. The northern perimeter had been secured. Lights had come back on across the installation in a slow spreading grid, each section coming online one by one as power was restored and tested. She watched the lights come on and thought about the lights going out and thought about everything that had happened in the hours between. "I looked for you," Daniel said quietly. "When it started, when the first explosion hit, my first thought was, where is Rachel? And I couldn't find you. And that was..." He stopped. "That was the worst 20 minutes of my life." She turned to look at him. "I was on the ridge." "I know that now. I should have told you. Before I went up, I should have found you first. You didn't have time." "No," she paused, "but I still should have tried." He looked at her. "Is that what the next conversation looks like? Both of us accounting for what we should have done differently?" "Probably some of it." "Okay." He pulled her slightly closer. "I can do that conversation." "I know you can." They stood together at the edge of the recovery and watched the base come back to life and said nothing for a while, which was its own kind of language. The language of two people who had been through something that had permanently rearranged the furniture between them and were still deciding together what the new arrangement looked like. She was aware of his warmth beside her and aware of her own physical exhaustion, and aware underneath both of those things of something she had not expected to feel on the other side of this day. Gratitude, not for the battle, not for any of it, not the fact that she'd had to climb that ridge or that the base had been hit or that Garrett had sat across from her in that room with his redacted folder, but for the simple, irreducible fact that the people she cared about were still standing, that the lights were coming back on, that her husband's arm was around her shoulders and his heartbeat was steady and real, and she could feel it against her side. She had come to this mountain because she knew something was wrong. She had been right. And then she had done the thing she had spent 6 years telling herself she was done doing, and she had done it without hesitation and without error, and the people she came here for were alive because of it. She thought about the question of identity, the one Daniel had asked on the mountain path, the one Garrett had implied in the room with the closed door, the one she had been asking herself in quieter ways for 6 years. Who are you? She had given Daniel the beginning of an answer. She had given Garrett a different piece of it. But the full answer she understood now was not something that could be given in a single conversation or a single day. The full answer was something like this. She was a woman who had been built by 8 years of war into something extraordinary and had then tried with genuine effort and genuine love to be something quieter. She had not fully succeeded at the quieter thing, but she had not failed at it either. She had built a marriage that mattered. She had built a life with actual weight to it. She had learned imperfectly to sit in a kitchen with coffee and not read every room as a battlefield. And when the battlefield came to find her, when it followed her here to this mountain and hit the wire of this base and threatened the people she had crossed a state in a pickup truck with a country music fan to get back to, she had not flinched. She had not hesitated. She had gone up the ridge and done what needed doing with iron sights and borrowed time and 8 years of muscle memory that had never fully gone to sleep. Both of those things were true simultaneously. The woman who wanted the quiet life and the woman who could hold a shot at 300 meters under fire. They were not opposites. They were the same person finally standing still, long enough to stop pretending was shoes. 3 days later, she stood at the main gate of FOB Granite with her duffel bag at her feet waiting for Pete's truck. Daniel was beside her. He had his hands in his jacket pockets and his eyes on the road, and they had spent the last 3 days doing the conversation, all of it in pieces in the evenings after his duties released him, and the base had settled into its post-incident rhythm of assessment and recovery. It had not been easy. Parts of it had been painful in the specific way that truth was sometimes painful, not because it damaged things, but because it required both of them to hold a more complex version of each other than the simpler one they had been carrying. But it was honest. Every word of it had been honest. She had told him about the missions, about the 8 years, about the 143, about the particular moral weight of that number and what she had done with it since she got out, the way she had carried it, the way she had tried to set it down, the way it had remained hers regardless of what she tried to do with it. He had listened without interrupting. He had asked questions that were real questions, not challenges. He had sat with what she told him and let it mean what it meant without rushing to make it mean something more manageable. At the end of the last conversation, he had said, "You're still you." She had said yes. He had said, I need a little time to catch up to the full version of you. She had said, take what you need. He had said, don't go too far. Now he was standing beside her at the gate with his hands in his pockets, and neither of them had much left to say. The important things had been said. The rest would come in time. Pete's truck appeared around the bend, country music audible from 40 meters away. Daniel turned to her, looked at her face with the same look he'd had in their room when she first arrived, like she was both a question and an answer. But the proportions had shifted. There was more certainty in it now, more weight. The look of a man who understood better what he was looking at, even if the understanding was still settling into its permanent shape. You'll call when you get back, he said. First thing. And the next conversation. I'll start it, she said. I promise. He nodded, picked up her duffel and handed it to her. She took it and slung it over her good shoulder, and he leaned in and kissed her once, not briefly, the kind of kiss that held something in it beyond itself. She let it. Then she stepped back and looked at him one more time. Daniel? Yeah, for what it's worth. She paused. Coming here was the right call. He looked at her. His eyes were full. Not broken, not overwhelmed, just full the way eyes were when they had been through something that mattered and were still standing on the other side of it. Yeah, he said quietly. It was. She turned and got in the truck. Pete had the radio on the same station. He pulled away from the gate, and the base shrunk behind her in the side mirror for her. The perimeter lights, the communications tower being repaired, the soldiers at their posts, the whole complicated, fragile, surviving thing that was FOB Granite. She watched it until the road curved and it disappeared. Then she turned forward and looked at the road ahead. How was the visit? Pete asked cheerfully. She looked at the road, at the ridgeline as they curved past it. She looked at it the way she always looked at high ground, the automatic professional sweep, the checking of lines and angles and cover positions. She couldn't help it. She had stopped pretending she could. Good, she said. It was good. Pete nodded and turned the radio up slightly and drove. She watched the ridgeline and thought about home and thought about Daniel and thought about the folder Garrett had slid across the table and the choice she had made when she slid it back. She thought about the answer she had given him. Fix the bases, don't build your solution around finding the next me. She believed that, she still believed it. And she also knew with the same quiet certainty she had known everything else on this mountain, that if the phone rang, if the situation was dire enough, if the stakes were real enough, if the people in the crosshairs were people who could not protect themselves, she would answer it. Not because she couldn't say no. She had said no. She meant it. But because she had learned on a maintenance shelf on a frozen mountain with iron sights and borrowed time that some things you carried didn't get lighter with distance. They just got more familiar. And familiar was not the same as gone. She had not left war behind when she left the Marines. She had brought it with her into every room she had ever walked into since reading the exits and the angles and the high ground, waiting for the moment it would need her again. The moment had come. She had been ready. She would always be ready. That was not a burden she had chosen to carry so much as a truth she had finally chosen to stop running from. And there was a difference between those two things, a difference that mattered, a difference she thought she might spend the rest of her life understanding more fully. The truck descended the mountain. The snow began to fall. And Rachel Carter, former Marine Scout, sniper wife woman in a gray fleece, with a bandaged arm and a duffel bag between her boots, looked at the road ahead and understood completely. Finally, without reservation, that she had never needed to be only one thing. She was all of it, every last piece. And every last piece had shown up when it counted most.